Hey, everybody, and welcome to the 2024-2025 school year, our first Mansueto colloquium of the year. And I'm really delighted and privileged to have with us today Jessica Trounstine. Jessica is the Centennial Chair and Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt. And I'm just reading the collection of her accolades here. She got her PhD from the University of California at San Diego in 2004. And prior to that, she was at the University of California at Merced for a number of years. I think of her as really being one of the people that was there at the beginning and put Merced on the map and did a lot of great work of institution building. She's written a number of really important books, starting with the most recent Segregation by Design, Local Politics and Inequality in American Cities, which is the winner of the best book in the field from the Urban Affairs Association, the David Greenstone Prize, the best book on race, ethnicity, and urban politics from the American Political Science Association. Prior to that, she wrote the award-winning book, Political Monopolies in American Cities, The Rise and Fall of Bosses and Reformers. And she's written, dozens of other books and articles, her broad area of interest is representation and inequality. And I would say Jessica is one of the, I think all of us have these sort of people in our research circles who, there's someone that whenever a new paper comes out by this person, you're just going to read it regardless of what the topic is, because it will be interesting. And Jessica is this, always been this person in this circle for me. So I'm really pleased to have her here. And without further ado, she will talk about protection of privilege.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks so much for being here. This is I'm excited to present this work to you. I'm going to present to you several pieces of a new book project that I'm working on. The book project is about polarization in local politics, but I'm not going to tell you anything about polarization today. I'm going to tell you about the first half of the book, which is how the elements of polarization get embedded in our urban geographies. And I'm going to argue that this is about the protection of privilege. Nice. Let me start then. Start it. Not. There we go. Okay. So in the first half of the 20th century, most children in the United States attended segregated schools. This was true in the South, where racial assignment was the law, but it was also true in the North, where it was not. Lawsuits built on the decision in Brown v. Board of Education worked to integrate schools in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. But since the 1980s, schools in the United States, elementary schools in particular, have resegregated to a very high degree. It is well understood that the cause of this school segregation today is underlying residential segregation. And while this might seem obvious to you, the way it works and how it's linked is actually a little fuzzy. I'm going to argue that this relationship is purposeful, that the generation of residential segregation is sought, in part, to preserve school segregation. I'm going to argue that privileged neighborhoods use the land use process to entrench school exclusivity. The development of land use regulations and zoning maps in the United States is a very local and intense political process. Cities hold public hearings to gather the inputs of residents, appointed planning commissions make recommendations, and ultimately, elected officials of the city are responsible for adopting land use regulatory plans. As cities grow and develop, these land use regulations are adjusted and amended over time. So we can think of the land use regulations that govern every parcel within a city as an accumulation of past political choices, which I'm going to argue ought to benefit particularly politically privileged neighborhoods. I'm going to build this argument in several steps. First, I'm going to use a computational model to show that economically restrictive zoning, that is preventing development at the lower end of the income distribution, produces demographic segregation. Then I'm going to use markers of privilege from historical maps combined with modern day parcel level zoning information to demonstrate that privileged neighborhoods have more restrictive zoning today. And finally, I'm going to show you that land use regulations are highly correlated with segregation between schools within school districts. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit more about this argument. So first, why would privileged neighborhoods seek government protection for exclusivity? Well, I'm going to propose that privileged neighborhoods want to protect and preserve the demographics of their neighborhood, and more importantly, the demographics of the schools that are associated with their neighborhood. We have lots of evidence that student performance is affected by peers, and white Americans continue to have strong preferences against racial mixing for themselves and for their children. Also, we know that school quality is capitalized into housing prices. So for all of these reasons, I expect that privileged neighborhoods will seek to protect that exclusivity. Of course, restrictive zoning has other benefits as well. And I have a sort of little list of things that zoning can do for a privileged neighborhood that I'm happy to talk about, but are not really central to what I'm arguing here. But restrictive zoning can build wealth for existing owners by limiting competition, by limiting development. Restrictive zoning can limit congestion, and there are arguments in the economics literature that restrictive zoning will prevent free riding. What that means in this literature is it will prevent lower income residents from entering into a higher income community and then taking advantage of the higher income services, but while paying a lower tax burden. But I'm not going to talk about those things. Generally, all of these goals are probably served by the activity that I'm going to talk about. And I can't really determine or disentangle why neighborhoods seek restrictive zoning, only that they do. But then you might ask, well, why might they seek government protection for this, for their exclusivity? After all, privileged neighborhoods are already filled with the right kind of people. What do they need local government to do here? The trouble is that individual property owners have incentives to undermine the goals of maintaining privilege by selling or renting their properties to undesirable residents. That was a sort of very vague way of saying this. So I'm going to tell you a story because I like to tell stories. So as Chris said, I used to live in Merced, California. I lived there for almost 15 years. And Merced, California is a tiny little agricultural town in the Central Valley of California. Everybody knows each other. Everybody knows everybody. That's important to this story. So I found out that I had gotten the job at Vanderbilt, and my husband and I decided that we needed to put our house on the market, sell our house, and we're moving to Nashville. Right around the corner from us in our little neighborhood where it's, huge numbers of faculty live in this little neighborhood, so we all know each other. Right around the corner from us, there's another house for sale. And this house is for sale for like $300,000 more than what our house is for sale for, which is great. I really love this, right? I love that this house is going to sell for a higher amount of money because then it's going to look like my house is like discount. So clearly everybody's going to want to buy my house. So we're paying a lot of attention to this other house that's on the market. And it sits. And it sits. And in California at this time, sitting on the market is weird. Like, why is this house sitting on the market? The market is hot. People are selling their houses left and right. So then we get worried. Well, it turns out that finally, this house around the corner from us had gotten an offer from an interested buyer. The interested buyer was a nonprofit organization that was seeking to convert the house into a small supportive housing complex for seniors. It was going to have 6 unrelated seniors living in this house. Six whole seniors living in this house. And the neighbors were beside themselves, outraged. absolutely outraged at this possibility of this multifamily use for this single family house. So they sued. They cause all of this trouble. They go before the planning commission, they go before the county supervisors, and they argue that this should not be permitted in their neighborhood. Well, it turns out, under the land use regulations, it's totally permissible in this neighborhood. But they make so much noise and they drag this out for so long that the nonprofit organization doesn't have the money to fight it. They pull out, they rescind their offer. Long story short, the neighbors end up quieting down. They sold their house for a loss, turned less than what we wanted to sell our house for. Everybody is sad about this, but the people who are the real winners are the neighbors who made all the noise. But they decided that making all the noise one property at a time was a giant pain in the neck. And a better strategy would be to go before the planning commission and argue that the whole neighborhood should be rezoned such that no other buyers could come in and do these nefarious things, sticking 6 unrelated seniors in a house together. They're in that process right now. I'll report back in a year whether or not they are successful. That is what I'm talking about. When privileged neighborhoods decide that they don't like some activity that might happen on the private market, a strategy that they can use is to go to the government and request regulations that will prohibit the property from being used in a way that these neighbors don't like. So that's the story that I'm going to tell over the long run. There are, of course, many factors that affect property markets and property values, but one important factor is the land use regulation that governs every parcel. A parcel is just a piece of land on which a residential property sits, right? Though that's how cities think about the world, is in parcels. Today, we know that cities affect housing affordability predominantly by using their land use regulations to disallow multifamily or high density development in favor of single family detached homes in certain neighborhoods or even in all neighborhoods. I'm going to refer to this type of behavior as restrictive zoning. And in other work that I've done, I've shown that restrictive zoning and racial segregation correlate in the aggregate. But again, we still aren't exactly clear how and why this works at a micro level. So that's where I'm going in this paper. I contend that privileged residents use their political power in the land use process to generate, protect, and entrench their exclusivity by maintaining low density zoning in their neighborhoods. I expect that privileged neighborhoods will achieve restrictive zoning designations. That's the first statement up here. And then the second statement here is I expect that housing type segregation in the zoning code is going to be associated with race and class segregation in schools. And I'm going to tell you more about what I mean by all of these things in just a minute. Since 1917, cities have been prohibited from directly racially zoning. Since 1949, they've been unable to enforce racially restrictive covenants. Since 1968, cities have not been able to refuse mortgages to people of color. They can't reserve parts of town for whites. They can't protect white property owners who discriminate. So how do governments create segregation? Today, they create segregation by creating differential costs in the housing market. I'm going to use NetLogo, which is a free computer program, to develop a computational model of segregation in order to explore the conditions under which segregation of housing types or housing costs is going to generate racial segregation. I'm going to try to figure out exactly how this works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to vary the starting assumptions of this model and see how residential segregation patterns change. First, I'm going to allow my residents in this model, and this is the best part about using computational models, and when you use NetLogo, it's free, you should download it and check this out. All of the residents are called turtles and they look like turtles and it's great because you have these little turtles moving around this computation. It's really fun. Okay, so first my turtles, residents, are gonna only consider the race of their neighbors. I'm gonna have them move into neighborhoods. I'm gonna have them look around and decide whether or not they like the race of their neighbors. If they don't like the race of their neighbors, they're gonna move. I'm gonna see what happens when I make just that assumption. I just have race be the driving factor for deciding where people are gonna live. Then I'm gonna make things a little more complicated. I'm gonna ask my residents, my turtles, to consider the race of their neighbors, and I'm gonna give them different abilities to purchase property. So I'm gonna create race-based wealth inequality in this model and see how that affects segregation. Then I am going to have residents consider the race of their neighbors. I'm gonna have them create race-based wealth inequality, and I'm gonna implement redlining, which is the concept that you've probably heard about before, which is simply preventing people of color from owning property in certain parts of town. Then finally, I am going to have residents consider the race of their neighbors and differ with regard to their wealth. And I'm gonna implement restrictive zoning. I'm gonna make it so that in some parts of town, low-income housing does not get built. And I'm gonna see how segregation gets affected by that process. In this model, I'm gonna show you in just a minute, it's a box space where I have 9 neighborhoods. And I'm gonna reserve, in some cases, 2 of those neighborhoods are going to be allowed to discriminate, or 2 of those neighborhoods are going to have restrictive zoning, but not at first. The parcels in my space have normally distributed value, and I use real census data, the 2009 median new home values, and then I give some of the home prices, I make some of the home prices a little higher on the edges, like the suburbs. I'm gonna have 2 types of residents. I'm gonna have majority residents, they're gonna be colored green, and I'm gonna have minority residents, they're gonna be colored blue. When I give them all income, they're going to have income that is estimated from the ACS for white and Black Americans. And I'm gonna change the shape of the residents so that you can follow them around the space. My residents with income above the citywide median are circle shaped, and residents with below median incomes are gonna be triangles. Okay, so I've got blue and green, triangle, circles. Those are the 4 types of residents I have. And as I mentioned, the residents are gonna decide if they're happy based on the assumptions that I put into the model, the race of the neighbors or the wealth of the neighbors. If they're unhappy, and they look around and they don't like their neighborhood, they're gonna move. And they're always gonna move in the direction of the most expensive house they can buy, right? They're gonna try to maximize whatever house they can get. They're gonna do that 500 times, and then I'm gonna stop the model and measure what segregation looks like. And I'm gonna simulate that 100 times and then show you the average segregation patterns for each of these different sets of assumptions. Okay? Everybody, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, when you say they consider race, are you kind of copying the threshold mechanism in the Schelling model?
Yeah. Right, so when they consider race, they look around and they say, are my other neighbors blue or are my other neighbors green? And I have a slider that allows them to be more or less tolerant. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm gonna set their tolerance levels to be exactly what the proportion is for the citywide demographics. So I can test these a million different ways, but I can't show you a million different tests. So in the test that I'm gonna show you, every scenario is gonna have 30% of the population is gonna be minority residents. And the minority residents are going to prefer to live among 30% minority residents, and the majority residents are gonna prefer to live among 70% majority residents. So they wanna match the citywide demographics. Other questions? Okay, this is exactly what your colleague was just asking. Here is Schelling's results. You may be familiar with this, right? What Schelling did in this famous paper is show that segregation, fairly high levels of segregation get produced, even if people have sort of moderate levels of racial tolerance, right? That you end up the space sorts in this way. So you can see how the model is running. I have 2,100 residents. Important to have some space to allow the residents to move. You can see that they're 30% minorities. And then I'm calculating all these different things. The dissimilarity index, which is the measure of segregation that I'm using here, across the 100 simulations of the Schelling model, produces a dissimilarity index of 0.17. This is not an important number in any abstract sense, right? This is not what segregation looks like in the real world. It's only interesting in comparison to the other models that I'm going to show you, okay? Okay, well, that's, instructive, right? We can see that there is segregation that gets produced when people don't want to live around residents of the other race. Maybe that's not super surprising. The problem is that Schelling's model is missing one of the most important aspects of the housing market, which is that every resident in this model can afford every house. And we know that that fundamentally restricts where people live. So let's add that. Here, I'm going to add the restriction that residents can only move to parcels that they can afford. And I'm creating wealth inequality. So my minority residents have lower incomes. The median wealth of minority residents is lower than the median wealth of my majority residents. So in this model, I give every parcel a value and I say, go toward your most expensive parcel and try to buy it and land there. If you can't afford it, you can't live there. And I let the model run and run and run and run 100 times. And you can see that once I add land value to Schelling's model, dissimilarity, the segregation index, decreases dramatically. An important piece of this model, this is going to become sort of the baseline that I'm going to compare against, is that I have added a couple of additional restrictions. What I was trying to do when I was building this model was create segregation. I wanted to see what restrictions can I add to the model? What assumptions can I add that will generate the kind of segregation that Schelling originally produced? So one of the additional features that I have here is that my wealthy residents, my circles, only want to live around at least two other circles. They want rich neighbors, right? And I can move that. I can make them want 100% rich neighbors, which has other interesting consequences. You might think of this model as asking what happens if governments were to regulate land use at the parcel level. Regulations might prohibit the development of a smaller home on any particular parcel, but these parcels are randomly distributed throughout the space. A final important feature of this model, and this is from the outset, is that parcel value endogenously increases when this model runs, when the parcel is surrounded by wealthy residents. So if there are at least 6 wealthy residents around a particular parcel, the land value goes up. And if there are 6 poor residents, the land value goes down. So you can see that as the model runs, they're shaded by white, from gray to white, right? Whiter is more expensive, grayer is cheaper. There is variation in housing costs, but it's random, right? It's spread all over the model. Variation in the cost of housing does not produce racial segregation, even though residents prefer same-race neighbors. There is racially stratified wealth inequality. Land values are affected by the wealth of the neighbors. Wealthy residents are seeking to live among other wealthy neighbors, and residents desire higher cost housing. So even with all of these, yeah, Chris.
Sorry, I just had a clarifying question. You said that you created a starting value, the value of each parcel?
Yes.
So that's just randomly distributed across the square?
Yes, except for the corners. So I don't have a picture of it. What I did was I created housing values are randomly populated, normally distributed with the median home sales values in 2009, starting from the starting in the center of the space. And then in the corners, I set the median home value normally distributed with a higher mean. So the corners start out with slightly higher housing values. But they go away because people are moving around so much.
And every agent has the same tolerance in race.
So
in the prior model, was 30%. That's
Same here. Same here, right? So the blue residents want at least 30% blue residents. And the green residents want at least 70% green residents. Or to be surrounding them.
There's no very, like, I think one of the key parts of Schelling model is distribution within each group.
Yeah, and so that it turns out that changing, I have some data on this that I've run a bunch of different simulations about this. It really matters that everybody have some racial preference, but after some threshold, it doesn't matter much at all.
Does the simulation change if the wealthy properties start off in the center?
No, and so one of the things I tried to do with this was I created like a downtown that was gentrifying. Like I have done so many different things trying to create segregation with this basic model. And I have been unable to figure it out, unable to do it, but I don't have any data to show you, but I have played around with concentric circles, right? Like the Chicago model, right? Like the, getting wealthier going out, getting wealthier going in various ways, and it doesn't matter. It gets disrupted very quickly. Any other questions?
Shouldn't minority be more favored?
They do. So they prefer to live among at least 30% other minorities.
But then I feel like this is basically no preference between each agent, right? Because like majority want to live with 70% majority,
Right.
30% minority.
Right.
And for minority, you want to live with 30% minority and 70% majority. They are basically the same.
And I could see these are changeable, right? I could change, but this is set right now to show you how these compare without moving these static indicators. But it is important, and as Chris was suggesting, right? So a lot of the papers that have been built on Schelling have tried to look at whether it is in-group preference or out-group intolerance that matters for the generation. And it hasn't mattered so far in my model. I leave open the possibility that I'm doing it wrong. So that's, it's all up for further conversation. So why then, if all of these factors are in place, do we not see the kind of segregation that we see in the Schelling model or in the real world? So next, I'm going to add redlining. And I could talk for a long time about what redlining is, how redlining works, but essentially what I do in the model is prevent my blue residents from locating in two of the corners. And you can see that is extremely effective. All of the blue residents get pushed out of the two corners. But one thing I want you to, and the dissimilarity index is much higher. It's as high, it's higher than the other two models, right? So racial segregation, purposeful racial segregation works, right? Redlining, preventing people of color from locating in these two neighborhoods is a very effective means of generating segregation. One thing you might notice about this model, though, is that there is very little economic segregation, right? So there are triangles and circles living right next to each other. And but also these two corners have increased housing values dramatically relative to the rest of the space. And what I think is happening here, I can't see all of the changes occurring, is that there's the green circles are driving up housing prices and the green triangles are trying to get to the wealthier neighborhood, right? So that's what that picture looks like. It turns out, though, that this is illegal. Now, it is still done. There are still lots of practices that are illicit in the housing market, but technically, redlining is illegal. So finally, what I'm going to do is make it so that two corners of the space have parcels that are unavailable to the below median income residents. This is meant to mimic policies that exist in the real world today. Race-neutral policies like setbacks, floor area ratios, height limits, historic overlays, minimum lot sizes, development caps, impact fees, a prohibition on attached housing. or even many cities now are starting to play around with these things, defining what a family is. Cities can define in their ordinances that a family consists of no more than 2 unrelated adults. That makes it so that, say, a group of college students cannot rent a house in a single family neighborhood, or a bunch of elderly residents can't all live in a single family house in my neighborhood. Cities can also ban renting completely, and they're playing around with this a lot with Airbnb, right? So preventing renting in various ways. All of these are strategies that you should recognize on their face in the code is race neutral, but are focused around economic outcomes, right? So these are strategies that drive up the cost of housing for some parcels and not for others. Very important piece of the way that cities do this is that they don't just put floor area ratio limits or prevent attached housing on a single parcel here and there. They define whole segments of the city to be defined by a particular land use regulation. That's how it works. Thus, I think it's a fairly good reflection of what this picture is showing you. So these 2 corner spaces have parcels that are unavailable to below median income residents. And you can see that the model generates substantially higher segregation than the second figure that I showed you. It's not as high as the Schelling model, and it's not as high as the redlining model, but it is significantly and substantially higher than the model without the economic zoning. And once we have economic zoning, you can see that there are blue residents and green residents in these spaces, and they're all circles, right? With the triangles sort of hanging about the edges where the property is a little bit cheaper because it hasn't driven up the housing costs there. And the rest of the space is also fairly segregated as well. What I have concluded here is that this is fairly good theoretical evidence that economic zoning, that zoning regulations that are focused on changing the cost of housing has the potential to generate racial segregation with these in this context. Yeah.
Is restrictive zoning necessary and sufficient, or just like, do you need the?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I've been playing around with the sufficient part of this. So there are 2 exceptions to this pattern. So one thought I had was, well, maybe this is highly dependent on racial tolerance. And so I reran the model, doing 100 simulations each time, changing the threshold for white resident, for my majority residents at 5% increments. And at every increment, restrictive zoning does a better job at producing segregation than non-restrictive zoning. Where this falls apart is if I make both resident types indifferent to the race of their neighbors. If I set it so that my minority residents are agnostic about who they live among, you only see economic zoning producing racial segregation once the majority residents have a racial intolerance of about 40%. So above that, between 0%, if they will tolerate between 0% and 39% other race neighbors, restrictive zoning doesn't have this consequence. The other way in which this model breaks down is if they have similar wealth distributions. If they have similar wealth distributions, the model breaks down much more quickly depending on racial preference. But I can recreate it by having my wealthy residents only want to live among other wealthy residents. So, there's too many levers to pull here at once. I have too many variables, essentially. But I've been trying to break the model in various ways, and I would love to hear your suggestions about other things I might try to see where economic zoning fails to produce the higher segregation effect.
Sorry to have you with questions. This is super interesting. I don't know if this is my eyes playing tricks on me, but it looks to me that once you've introduced restricted zoning in the corners, it looks like segregation is also higher in the places that are not zoned.
It is.
Is that just and if so, what what is the mechanism that would generate, why are unzoned places getting more segregated by introducing zoning in different jurisdictions?
Something is, I don't know exactly the answer to this, but I've been trying to take snapshots at various moments when the model is running to see when the sorting is occurring. And what seems to be happening is as these wealthy, so remember, income is normally it's distributed with a gamma distribution. So income is variable across my residents. These are the richest people. And so once the richest people are sort of moved into the richest parcels and they drive up the housing costs, then there's some set of residents, even above median income residents, who can't afford to live there, but now they can afford these cheaper parcels. So I think it has to do with the relationship between housing costs and that you're taking the richest people out of the housing market and putting them in the corners. Then it allows these closer to median income residents to build clusters of wealthy communities at lower in the grayer parcels. I think that's what's going on. But again, it's hard to figure out. I need to create more metrics and have like reporting going on so I can know when the dissimilarity jumped, basically. But it seems, you can see it jumps right away and then it is pretty flat. And so there's some moment at which this is occurring in my fictitious.
Does it happen because basically you're changing the proportion of immigrants to minority to majority members in everything that is not zoned? Right, so basically that drives the clustering of majority members.
Right, so the clustering is driven by the combination of these two factors, right? The wanting to sort around the rich people and wanting to sort around other like residents. But maybe you're right? So part of this is that the blue circles are being moved to these corners as well, which then induces other sorting, right? It allows for these wealthier areas to be all green. And so they get to serve their preference for same race neighbors without worrying about wealth. Yeah, I think that's insightful. Yeah, thanks.
Income of all the residents stable throughout?
Yes. Income is stable.
If you're a lower than median income person who happens to live in a rich neighborhood, when you're able to sell it, will you not get some sort of benefit?
That would be lovely. Yeah, no, that is not included in this model and probably way beyond my programming capacity. So, but yes, there is, right, you might imagine that there are other benefits to the lower income residents from moving into these wealthier neighborhoods. Right now, all their benefit is solely driven by the fact that they're on a parcel that is the most they can afford, and they're surrounded by other residents of their type.
Have you contemplated doing the redlining and then the restrictive and then trying to undo it?
No, so I've got this question, like, can I reverse this process is a really interesting question. And right, so I think what you're suggesting is how like history actually worked, right? Like first we had redlining and property values were driven up in these suburban whiter communities, and then redlining officially goes away, but it's not as though we started back at this spot. Right? We're starting from a segregated place. And that is a great place for me to transition to the next part of my talk, which is to say that in the real world, this stuff is way stickier. So what I wanted to do was analyze, what if I made these things not so sticky? Could I produce segregation in sort of some dramatic way? It's easy to fall back on the stickiness, essentially, for me, right? I can say this happened a long time ago. These patterns were set in the 1930s, 1940s, and there's nothing that can be done about it. But really, that's not true. There are places that did have were redlined or it had racially restrictive covenants, and they are generally whiter today, but it's the correlation is not what. Right? There is movement on the edges. There are changes around there is neighborhood transition that occurs over this 100-year period. So the model is not faithful to reality, but I take your point, right? That it would be instructive to try to build one of these segregation models and then see if I remove the segregation or the redlining at some point as the model is running, can I get back to this space?
You could actually train a model. Story.
One could.
But when you look at Woodlawn and the park.
Yeah.
It's a perfect history and the census data is there.
Yes.
You could even get potentially these different factors.
That,
It's super tricky.
yes, and as I said, I think beyond my programming capacity, but I'll make a note of it for my future graduate students who are going to be wizards at these things. Yeah.
I think one solution can be just use whatever resource you got from the redline model as the starting.
As the
model.
starting point. Yeah, I have more work to do on this, and I appreciate your suggestion.
Yeah, happy to chat.
Okay, so this is the theoretical evidence that I'm basing the rest of the argument upon, right? That restrictive zoning serves as a substitute for racial zoning in some way, or racially restrictive behavior. And so it is that which neighborhoods that want to protect their demographics will seek today. They will seek this kind of economically restrictive zoning in order to produce the demographic segregation that we see in this model. For as long as cities have existed, privileged neighborhoods have sought to maintain their exclusivity. We have lots of evidence of this over the history of the United States. But for many decades, they relied on restrictive private mechanisms like restrictive covenants and racial steering to achieve their goals. The use of zoning as a tool to protect neighborhoods became much more pronounced in the post-World War II period, when explicit discrimination through restrictive covenants and racial steering became technically illegal. So my task is to identify neighborhoods that had markers of privilege before zoning blanketed the United States, before this dramatic increase in restrictive zoning. And I have some data on sort of when that occurs in other pieces that I've written, but you'll just have to believe me that it's mostly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that we see this sort of onset of restrictive zoning. So to identify privileged neighborhoods at an earlier time period, I'm going to use a set of maps that you are all very familiar with. I'm going to use them in a different way than many people have used them, though. So this set of maps was produced by the federal government Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. And HOLC details neighborhood conditions in 211 communities across the United States in the 1930s and early 1940s. The goal of HOLC's maps was to describe the credit risk of refinancing foreclosed mortgages in particular neighborhoods. A lot of research has been done on these maps. We now know that most of HOLC's loans were actually given in these red areas, not in the green and blue neighborhoods. And I can talk more about that if you're interested, but that's not the point. Every neighborhood in these 211 communities was rated by a HOLC employee or a city government official, and they sign their names at the bottom. So I have the full list of who they all are. In every sheet, so they have a sheet that they describe for every neighborhood. They describe the terrain, the inhabitants, and then they list favorable influences and detrimental influences, and they end up giving every neighborhood a rating. And the rating is are the ones that you are familiar with. They are green, blue, yellow, and red. Green is best, blue is pretty good. I have to remember the name of it. Yellow is declining, and red is hazardous. And if you look at the map of Chicago, you will recognize all the neighborhoods, right? You will see it in your lived experience today that these neighborhoods are they look similar. Importantly, though, these maps did not appear to actually limit lending by the federal government, and the ratings were not mostly guided by race. Proximity to schools was often included as a favorable influence, but this was equally true in red and green neighborhoods. So there is no relationship at this time in terms of the kinds of factors that I'm going to measure in the end in describing these ratings. I am literally just using these maps to provide a historical snapshot of exclusivity. I want to know, where did the privileged people live? And what are they going to do to protect that privilege? If land use regulations protect privilege, we should find that neighborhoods that were rated more highly by HOLC should work to defend their exclusivity through more stringent land use regulations today. There are lots of reasons why I might be wrong. Maybe the growth machine dominates in all of these cities, and then we would expect the city government to want to put more housing in the green and blue neighborhoods because that's where housing values are going to be highest, right? Maybe density is sort of randomly determined. Or maybe land use regulations are just overlaid on existing housing stock. They're not actually produced in any sort of way that is instrumental or strategic. It's just they just reflect what actually exists. So for all of these reasons, it could be possible that there is no relationship at all between the grading, the HOLC grading, and the land use regulations today. But we don't know. I wouldn't be standing here if I really didn't know.
And the orientation of the map, is that Alameda at the bottom?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, that's Alameda at the bottom. So for those of you who are familiar with the
Yeah.
Bay Area. So the reason why I'm showing you this map of Oakland and not a map of Chicago, which would make more sense since I'm standing here in Chicago, is that I don't have data from Chicago. What I have is some very cool data from the Bay Area. In 2021, I partnered with the Association of Bay Area Governments, ABAG, terrible acronym, and MTC, which is the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And I did some work for them mapping segregation in every community in the Bay Area. And in exchange for my efforts, they provided me with parcel level zoning information for every parcel in the Bay Area. It's more than 2 million parcels in total. And I have one snapshot. I know in 2021 what the zoning designation was for every single piece of land in the Bay Area. I have 3 variables that are important. One is a dummy indicator noting whether or not a parcel is zoned residential or something else. A dummy indicator noting whether a residential parcel is zoned for single family use or multifamily use. And then third, I know the dwelling units per acre that is allowed for every parcel. You want to think about this as the lot size. How big of a house can I build on my parcel, right? So if there are places here in Illinois and there are places in California where the max DUA is 2, how big of a parcel is that? You have 2 dwelling units per acre. How big is your parcel? Half acre, right? So these are houses that are on half-acre lots, right? And there are whole cities where the whole city has to be half-acre lots. Mostly, single-family zoning is about 8 dwelling units per acre. That tends to be in California. That's basically the average DUA for single-family zoning. As I mentioned before, the primary land use mechanism that generates segregation is the prohibition of density in certain neighborhoods. And these 3 variables capture this variation at the parcel level exactly as I want them to. So using GIS, I joined the parcel data with the HOLC neighborhood data for the Bay Area. And I analyze how the HOLC neighborhoods look today in terms of their zoning. I also include the 1940 census data on the whether or not what that constructed housing was in a particular neighborhood. So my measure is the share of a particular neighborhood that was built as single family homes in 1940. So that's sort of trying to account for the possibility that maybe zoning just maps onto what was already there. In total, I have about 330,000 block groups with complete data. 8% of these block groups are rated as green by Hulk, 26% are blue, 37% are yellow, and 29% are hazardous. I don't have information on schools from the 1940s because that doesn't really exist in terms of school quality, but I do have the racial composition of schools in these neighborhoods. So I have public school enrollments for these areas reveal that about 91% of public school enrollments in the green areas were white children. In the blue areas, about 75% of public school children were white. In yellow areas, about 67% of school children were white, and in the red areas, 43% of public school children were white.
This is as of 1940, is that reason?
This is as of 1950.
And does white include Asian?
No, white includes white. Only in, so in the 1950 census, up until the 1980 census, white is, there are no cross tabulations, so. So here it is. What you can see is that neighborhoods that were rated higher by Hulk have different land use designations in 2021. And we can go across the bottom here. So each bar is colored for its Hulk grade. And you can see that the Hulk neighborhoods that were green are the block groups that represent those green neighborhoods are about, their single family designation today is about 75%, right? About 75% of green Hulk areas are zoned for single family only use. Compared to the red Hulk zones are zoned for single family use, though about 42% are zoned for single family use. I'm gonna skip this second set of bars and come over here to this residential set of bars. What these bars are telling you is these zones in the Hulk maps were all residential in 1930. So how many of these neighborhoods preserved their residential status instead of being converted to light industrial or industrial use? And although the bars are very close together, you can see that the one difference is that the red neighborhoods were less likely to maintain their residential status over the course of this period. They are more likely to end up being zoned industrial or semi-industrial use by 2021. This final set of bars is looking at that zone density, the dwelling units per acre. And you can see that as we move up, as we move across, that the zoned DUA increases for these neighborhoods. There are approximately 2 fewer dwelling units per acre allowed at each Hulk grade. Given that the median max density is about 12 dwelling units per acre, 1 additional dwelling unit per acre is a meaningful increase. So although the bars are close together, it's powerful. I was also able to encode older zoning maps for a subset of cities. So I couldn't get all the cities in the Bay Area old zoning maps, but I was able to get several. And in this last analysis, I looked to see how Hulk designations are related to changes in single family zoning. And that is what these bars represent. And you can see that as these cities are changing their zoning code, green neighborhoods are more likely to maintain their single family designation, and red neighborhoods are less likely to maintain their single family designation.
Can you just walk us through, all the numbers are positive, so I don't know. What does 0.4 mean?
So these are estimates of the share of the neighborhood that maintains its zoning status. So approximately 15% of the red neighborhoods maintain the exact same zoning status. And so what you can see here is that there is some change to the single family zoning even among the green neighborhoods. That suggests during this time period, California is getting more and more aggressive about pushing multifamily zoning. And so what's happening is parcels within these neighborhoods are getting zoned for multifamily use. So they're losing their complete dominance of single family zoning during this time period.
I'm sorry, the change is between what time periods?
It's between the earliest time period it's different for the different cities. So it's essentially, I have maps from the 1930s, 40s, 60s, 70s, and those are my early time periods. And so I'm just measuring any change in the neighborhood between my early time period and my later time period. It's not a good panel.
And so just, sorry. but-
No, that's great.
The 0.4 for the green bar is telling you 40% of the parcels.
Yes.
In the green zone maintained their residential status between the early period and then
That's right.
and the current period.
Right.
Meaning 60% didn't.
Right.
The big change is there, but nowhere near as big as.
Right.
you know.
But it's this is parcels, right? And so the whole neighborhood is maintained its single family status, right? Overall, but there are pieces of there are parcels within the neighborhood that are getting transitioned.
The set of bars on the left called single family, that pertains to parcels also?
That is the collective, right? Is the
Okay.
share,
Okay,
total share.
so moving between the first and second set of bars, we're also moving our level of geography.
Yeah.
The neighborhood.
To the parcel, yeah. Should have been more clear, yeah.
So I'm really fixated on, right, the sort of, work of the political actors here. So in terms of this, were you able to obtain any information about UC Berkeley's role in this as one of the biggest, landowners in the Bay
No,
Area?
unfortunately, I don't have any information at all about how these designations are generated. And I've done some looking, and unfortunately, there's just not a lot of obvious places to look for where to see this political power being exercised. So what I have is this correlation, but I don't know what's happening inside of it. I don't know how these maps are getting created. I don't know what's happening at I don't know what's happening. So the last piece of this is to ask how segregation is related in schools versus the zoning code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build several measures of segregation using that parcel level data that I just described and census data that is merged to the parcel data. My independent variable in this analysis is a measure of the degree to which neighborhoods that are zoned for multifamily homes are spatially separated from neighborhoods that are zoned for single family homes. So I'm going to calculate entropy measure, which is the mix of housing types within each school catchment zone and the mix of housing types in the school district as a whole. And I'm going to calculate an index of zoning segregation that is captured at the school catchment area relative to the school district. I calculate similar variables for my dependent variables, which is race and class segregation across schools within the school districts. So in the case of race segregation, I am using white residents versus non-white residents. And then for class segregation, I'm using the share of families eligible for free and reduced lunch versus those who are ineligible. So I'm trying to figure out where are the schools where predominantly low-income kids, predominantly children of color are enrolled versus schools where there are predominantly higher income or predominantly white children enrolled. So I calculate these measures of segregation for every school district in the Bay Area. There are 132 school districts in the Bay Area of California. And remember that these measures, segregation measures, are always captured at the community level, right? There is one measure of segregation for each unified school district or each school district. And here is the final result here, which is that you can see that segregating the type of housing across neighborhoods is positively associated with segregation along race and class lines. When cities segregate housing types in the zoning code, schools are segregated along race and class lines. And you can see here, I don't usually make a big deal out of the R squared, but it's high in this case, right? So about a third of the variation in income segregation and racial segregation across schools is accounted for by the variation in segregation in the zoning code. This is not segregation of people in housing. This is segregation in the housing code, right? This is whether or not houses can be built in a particular area that are multifamily or single family. So at the end of the day, I think I've provided evidence that segregation in the zoning code is related to segregation in schools. I also have data on it being correlated with segregation in cities as well. But this is where I've ended up. Segregation generates inequalities along race and class lines. And it has meant historically that schooling experienced by racial and ethnic minorities and low-income individuals is inferior to the schooling that is experienced by white residents and the wealthy. But we're still learning how this segregation is generated and maintained. I've argued that segregation was built by public policy and is maintained today by public policy. These are not the choices of the preferences of the children or families of color in these segregated schools. They are predominantly, I've argued, the preferences of the people who have benefited from their exclusion. Understanding how the segregators capture and maintain power is essential to understanding public policy. And for next steps, I have a lot of work to do to better understand this political power, and that's where this work is going.
Do we have time for questions, or at least those who have time to take the questions?
First of all, wonderful job. This is so cool to see. Something that I'm really fascinated with is, yes, we're looking at city maps and, you know, you showed the Oakland Hulk map or the Chicago Hulk map, but, you know, schools are such a good example of showing how there's hyper segregation by flocking to the suburbs, right?
Yeah.
Have you run these scenarios on kind of a metropolitan area rather than a city area?
Yes. So the larger project considers different levels of segregation. And the kind of segregation that you're talking about is between city segregation or between school district segregation rather than within school district or within city segregation. And so I can run these exact same models looking at segregation between school districts within counties, but there are only 11 counties in the Bay Area, so I only have 11 observations, right? And so it falls apart pretty quickly if I don't have enough data. And because I don't have zoning data across the United States, it's really hard. But that is all to say that we have lots and lots of evidence that the first move that people made historically was to move to segregated neighborhoods. But then the big move that they made was to move to segregated cities, right? And now, as segregation has changed over the course of the last 50, 60 years, segregation within cities peaked in 1970 across the United States and has declined fairly precipitously since then. What hasn't changed is segregation across cities and across school district lines. So that peaked in the 1980s and has basically remained constant. So segregation, and I've been working on sort of some maps to add to this. If you were to see maps of the Bay Area school districts, there are plenty of school districts that have literally no zoning for multifamily housing, right? That's going to create segregation across school districts and zero segregation within the school district. Every single school in that school district is all white and wealthy, right? And so that, but I don't have the data. All I have is sort of, you know, evidence. I don't have good enough evidence to show.
Like San Mateo's like 90%.
Right.
Like 95. It's crazy.
Is it, I live on the West Coast, so this is really interesting, and I've lived in that area. And there's a lot of work going on right now to increase density.
Yep.
In West Coast cities. Is it too soon to study that impact?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
It's also, so not only is it too
Because it's been
soon,
going on for a few years, but I figured, yeah,
it's actually been going on since the 60s, but only with real teeth in the last like 5 years.
5 years, yeah.
And one thing to say, this is a very pessimistic sort of view that I have about this, is that
I know where you're going.
residents of the most exclusive communities find ever increasingly inventive ways to maintain their exclusivity. And so
Airbnb host.
So although I'm optimistic for the builder's remedy and split parcels and sort of upzoning in various ways to have effects on the margins, I think that Ross and Fairfax and so all of the most exclusive communities are still going to be the most exclusive.
I think you also have to look at there's also very progressive building laws that prohibit a lot of building of multi-density that it makes it all cost prohibitive as well, right? So that has to have been overlaid, especially on the West Coast, so.
That is, the data indicate that housing, that development costs, that construction costs
Yeah.
are not the primary driver of high housing costs.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is great. My first question would be how deterministic are school assignments or school districts in California specifically?
Actually, that's a really interesting question you asked. So it varies. So different school districts have different rules. So Berkeley is the most segregated city by the zoning code in the whole data set. And it's the least segregated school district. And so I thought there must be an error in my data. And I spent weeks trying to find the error in my data. And then I finally thought about the question that you've just asked, which is how are kids assigned to schools in Berkeley? Not by neighborhood. And they did that on purpose, right? Yay for Berkeley, right? They have clusters of schools, and depending on your neighborhood, you can apply to all these different clusters of schools. So it's variable, and the schools in Berkeley are not segregated at all because of this, even though Berkeley is very segregated in the zoning code and is very segregated demographically. So the way that these data work, because I downloaded the school catchment data from the California Department of Education, a school district like Berkeley, the school catchment zone is the whole city. And so it automatically produces the outcome that I need it to produce, even though I didn't understand why it was producing that outcome. So I'm confident that the data are taking into account what you've asked, which is how are kids assigned to the school. But I actually don't know, there's 132 and I'm sure they're all slightly different.
And then my second kind of suggestion would be to kind of look into the timing of moves. So I assume the parents are quite strategic. They know when their kids are starting school. So it would be really interesting if there was a way to kind of tease out when parents decide to move into a good school district.
Yeah.
Really like hone in on their strategy.
Yeah, I've learned, so I've lived in Nashville for a year now, and I've been learning a lot about schools there and things like that. And I've learned that everybody sends their kids to public school until 4th grade. And then 5th grade, everybody freaks out and sends their kids to private school. And I can't figure out why 5th grade. 5th grade seems like a weird year to pick for freaking out, but I would have to know like what the local culture was. Probably it's middle school. But it could be elementary school. It could be that preschool's okay, but elementary school is not, right? So I think you're right that understanding parental choice as a way to get at what their preferences are would be like the timing of their moves would be very helpful.
Thanks very much for the presentation. Super interesting. I was really struck by the second plot for your simulations where there's not really much racial segregation in the case where there's no residential zoning. I'm wondering, are there metros in the US where there's little zoning restrictions, and could you bring some data to support this simulation showing potentially less racial segregation in those?
That's an interesting idea. I think the short answer is no, right? So Houston is this famous, like, we don't zone, we don't do that, but they do, right? They have the tons of different kinds of regulations that actually prohibit development in certain ways, but not, yes, Chris, I know you wrote the paper. Tell me about it.
But that's kind of the point.
Right.
Like the point is absent zoning, they would just maintain segregation some other way.
Some other way, other land use regulations. I think that to get at your point though, is to try to figure out time periods, maybe not cross-sectionally, but there are moments at which cities do implement something new, like, oh, we've now planned unit developments. Like that's a new thing. We didn't have planned unit developments before. And now this is our new strategy. And so maybe rather than thinking about this cross-sectionally, I could figure out a place that has become, and I do have the data of segregation data starting in the early 1900s. And so I could find places where there were big jumps and try to understand, at those moments, what's going on, right? Is it, or take a look at the time period before. And that's been my strategy, is just to look at the moments when zoning didn't exist and look at what segregation looked like at those moments. And of course, segregation existed, right? But it looked different. And one of the things I like to think about is how segregation patterns change across the United States. So, there are some cities where you have block to block segregation is predominant. So New Haven is a good example of this, right? You can, like 3 blocks away, you might be in an all Black neighborhood or an all white neighborhood. Detroit is not that way. Chicago is not that way. The blocks are much bigger. The areas are much bigger. Atlanta, the areas are much bigger. And I think a lot of that is like historic demographic settling, and then the question is, how does regulation get overlaid on that or stick that in? I don't know. There's a lot of questions to be answered there, but I like that idea. The least segregated, most diverse metro area in the whole United States is Riverside, California. Just piece of information. Yeah.
Thinking of next steps, I'm really fascinated with these race neutral policies, the setbacks, the parking minimums, ADUs, et cetera, et cetera. What have you seen in your research, one of these being kind of top of the list as being the most preventative to kind of unlocking the neighborhood?
Getting rid of it.
Yeah.
So Minneapolis was like the poster child for upzoning, right? So Minneapolis had this, like, the city council made this famous statement where they were like, we were racist in the past and now we're not gonna be racist anymore. And all of our parcels are now quad zoned, which you can build up to 4 units. If all these things are in place, then you can build 4 units on any parcel. And lo and behold, like 3 development permits were pulled. And it didn't make any difference at all. And it turned out that there were all of these other regulations in place that were prohibiting the upzoning from taking effect. And so they did a new study and they figured out what those regulations were and they rolled them back in bundles. So unfortunately for us as social scientists, they did not do them one at a time. So I would have been great if they would have staggered, right? I kind of like randomly assigned some neighborhoods to have, we don't know, but so on top of that, it seems to be very regionally specific what the tool of choice is. Now in Nashville, we have multi-family zoning is available everywhere. There's no single family zoning in Nashville in general, and developers are extraordinarily powerful. There's all these sort of ways that they do lot splits and huge, like they call them tall skinnies, but they build these houses that are like 5 stories tall and on these little tiny footprints. And the thing that prevents that in Nashville is historic overlays. And I only learned this by interviewing about, like, meeting with a bunch of like housing advocates and trying to figure out like where is your pain point? And they'll tell you, right? My pain point is that we can't build a thing because of this historic overlay. But that led me to believe that the cities, there are different cultures about which tool is going to be most effective. And I don't know how to figure that out, unfortunately.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, thank you, Jessica.